At MidAmerican Energy, we're one company serving 1.6 million people who all need energy that's available 24/7. That's why we work 24/7. That's why we make investments in our systems that make us more resilient to extreme weather. That's why we generate power from all available resources to cover the variables in supply and demand. And that's why when the power is knocked out, we work around the clock to restore power to you. MidAmerican Energy, obsessively, relentlessly at your service.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us for this Iowa Ideas session, Utility Costs Explained. We have a lot to get to this session, but just to start off with some introductions, my name is Olivia Cohen. I'm the Energy and Environment reporter here at the Gazette. And today on our panel, we are joined by Chaz Allen, the Executive Director for Iowa Utilities Association, Jeff Danielson, the Vice President of Advocacy Clean Grid Alliance, Bob Rafferty from the Rafferty Group, Eric Sears, Senior Vice President of Regulation for MidAmerican Energy, and Josh Mandelbaum, Senior Attorney with the Environmental Law and Policy Center. Before I pass it on to our panelists for a little bit of their own introductions, I just want to say a quick thank you to MidAmerican for sponsoring the session. So now we can just kick it off a little bit with some brief introductions from our panelists. Let's start with Bob. How about you?
Yeah, so I'm here really in my role as the Executive Director for Iowa Business for Clean Energy, which is a nonprofit that was created a few years ago to really help foster a discussion about how we need to change the way we regulate our electric grid. So happy to be here, participate.
Thank you. Let's go to Eric next.
Hi, thank you. Eric Sears. I work in regulation and government affairs for MidAmerican. I have been involved in the energy industry, I don't know, probably about 15 years now, and I've looked at this from various different angles. Former commission staff with the regulator. I also spent several years litigating rate cases and mergers on behalf of consumers as a consumer advocate. And now I currently work in regulation for MidAmerican Energy Company.
Thanks so much. We'll go to Chaz next.
Well, I'm Chaz Allen, and I've been at the Iowa Utility Association for about 5 years now. My background in investor-owned utilities is more of telecom from 1997 to 2010, and my roles is billing operations and customer relations and government relations for Iowa Telecom, MCI, and WorldCom.
Great, thank you. Next, we'll go to Jeff.
Thank you, Olivia, and thank you, fellow panelists. I look forward to conversation today. Clean Grid Alliance works in 9 states and the entire MISO region when it comes to MISO advocacy. In those 9 states, we have public relations and advocacy teams. Our goal is to increase the amount of utility scale clean energy projects that are built. Wind, solar, battery storage, here comes hydrogen as those projects become commercially viable. And then we're very interested in a modern grid that can connect clean energy economies, both inside of Iowa, but across the Midwest region. We represent about 70 different companies and organizations who all are aligned on the goal of building more clean energy for both economic reasons and climate reasons.
Great, thank you so much. And Josh.
I'm Josh Mandelbaum. I'm a senior attorney with the Environmental Law and Policy Center. We're a Midwest-based environmental organization, so we work everywhere from Ohio to Iowa and Minnesota and everywhere in between. And we've got a clean energy team. We focus a significant amount of the work that we do on the clean energy transition, climate solutions, clean air, and clean water. And that obviously intersects tremendously with the utility space and everything that happens in the context of what is going on relative to utilities. And so we engage a significant amount there, particularly in front of the Iowa Utilities Commission, but we also have folks on staff dealing with larger regional and national. So we have folks who do some work at MISO and FERC as well.
Great. Well, thank you to the five of you. So now moving into some questions and just really getting into, the core of this session. Most people aren't really aware of how utility rates are set. Can we walk through that process of how you go about setting those rates?
Sure, Olivia, I could start off with this one. I think the thing that always struck me as sort of weird, particularly when I first jumped into the energy space, is unlike most companies, like if you wanted to change the price of bread or whatever product you're offering, that's something that the company decides to do and they implement it. Well, particularly electric and gas utilities, it's a different story. The state is heavily involved, both I would say both the state and the federal level, heavily involved in setting those rates. And there's a specific reason for that. I mean, it really gets back to something called the regulatory compact, and that's sort of I would say an unwritten agreement between states and particular utilities that has to do with how capital intensive it is for electric utilities. I mean, the amount of capital necessary to deliver an electric and gas on a consistent and a safe basis is very high. And so to prevent duplicative services, the state can grant an exclusive area in which a utility may operate in order to generate and transmit and distribute electricity or natural gas. But in exchange for that, there are some things that the utility has to give up. They have to accept all customers. So anyone who wants to connect in that specific service territory, they need to provide service to them. We submit to our state for regulation of the quality of the service that we provide. It has to be safe and it has to be reliable. And I think the major focus for this panel is we also submit to price regulation. So they get to determine what a reasonable cost or reasonable rate for our customers is in order to provide electric and gas utility service for them. And so that's it's sort of unique in having the government set in setting rates, but that's just sort of the setup for electric and gas utilities. And we can walk through a rate case process, or if that makes sense, or
Sure.
Sure. So, like I mentioned, we would need to submit to price regulation as a rate regulated utility. Typically, how this process starts off, if there can be any number of reasons why a utility may need to change its rates. A big driver are investments. Like we just mentioned, this is very capital intensive work that we do. And so any investments that are made that aren't currently being recovered, that could be a reason. It could be broader economic forces as well. Maybe there's inflation and the cost of materials, the cost of labor have gone up, or it could be a sort of a broader economic downturn. You may have businesses that are closing. You may have usage going down. So all of those and many other reasons could be reasons why a company comes in for a rate case. But this really starts off with notice. We provide notice both to our state regulator, which is the Iowa Utilities Commission, that a case may be coming. We would provide notice to the Office of the Consumer Advocate, which represents consumer ratepayer interests in the state of Iowa. And then we also provide notice to our customers. And there's the way things are set up in Iowa, we have to mail a notice to all of our customers, letting them know that we are seeking a rate increase and providing specific details about that. So once all of the notice has been provided, then the utility would file an application with the Utilities Commission seeking to change their rates. And that kicks off a formal sort of judicial process in which ultimately the commission will determine whether rates can be raised or changed at all. And if they can be changed, what is a just rate? What is an appropriate rate for our customers to provide? And I think an important thing to note is the burden of persuading the commission that rates should be changed at all, that lies with the utility. So we come in and support our application, our our request with a lot of information, a lot of testimony and exhibits that support the need for the change. And there will ultimately be other parties that intervene in this process, that look into that investigate that. And I think the main one being the Iowa Office of Consumer Advocate, which represents those ratepayer interests. And there are several other entities that do as well. But they come in, they review the filing. They have rights to ask lots of specific questions about and verify details in that filing. And then ultimately we go through a hearing process. And this is a public hearing process where any member of the public can either participate or follow along because they're streamed virtually from the Iowa Utilities Commission. And once that hearing is complete, the Utilities Commission will review the entire record and they will make a decision on, one, whether the rate should change at all, and then if they can change, what is an appropriate rate for our customers to pay. And so that is, in a nutshell, the process at a high level. But there are a lot of nooks and crannies you could fall into there, but that's generally how the process would go.
Thank you for that. I appreciate it. Is there anything else on that topic you'd like to add?
I think if you look at how we go about getting into a rate case, you've got your 5 Ps, you've got to plan it, you've got to present it, you've got to prove it, and you got to permit it, and then you got to place it. And in each of those first 3 steps, you'll have even the plan, like a resource plan. How are you going to provide, what kind of power are you going to provide? Wind, solar, natural gas, battery storage. Everybody's part of that plan. The stakeholders have a say in that plan through a resource plan. And then as you build that plan and then present it, well, then you have to prove it. And that's the part that the judicial hearing part of it, where all the stakeholders come back and say what they did or didn't like. And then the board obviously has to make a decision. And most of the time, I don't want to give a percentage, but most of the time, the stakeholders usually come to an agreement or a settlement of those rates before, and then that is presented to the board to be approved. So usually before it's approved, the stakeholders have all come together, the OCA, Rafferty's group or Josh, and they come to an agreement. And sometimes they don't, but that's usually how that works.
And I guess I would challenge the concept that there's a comprehensive plan that stakeholders have had a full say in being able to have input in. But we'll put that aside for now. I think one aspect of rate making that's important for people to understand is when the Utilities Commission sets those rates, there's 3 components that they're building into that rate. The first component is they'll look at the operating costs of the utility, and they have to make a determination with their limited staff and capabilities. Does this seem like a reasonable amount of operating expenses? And if so, they'll approve that, and that becomes part of that rate. The second part is, as was mentioned, they'll look at the capital assets, the investment in the infrastructure, and in many cases, that has already been approved through what's called a separate docket at advanced rate making. And so that in many ways, kind of then they get to recover that on a, depending on the life of that asset. For example, if it's a new generation plant that's going to last 25 years, they recover that over 25 years plus any interest related to debt. The third component is profit. And profit is not based on how efficient the system operates. It's based purely on a percentage of the capital assets that the utility has invested in. And so that's kind of an important distinction. That concept was generated 100 years ago in Chicago when they came up with this model of granting one utility a monopoly over a given geographic area, with the trade-off that, hey, have a government entity that will regulate the rates. And so that structure of how we set the rates has not changed, even though our grid is rapidly changing. So that's something that's, I think, important for us to talk about and explore.
Yeah, I'll add just a couple of things. I mean, one, just from a simplistic perspective, I mean, part of the reason the regulatory compact exists is the utility space is a fairly unique space in that there are state granted monopolies. And rate regulation is the flip side of that. In exchange for granting that state monopoly, which is unusual for private businesses, and for very good reason, as Eric pointed out, the duplication of really expensive infrastructure. But the flip side of that is the rate regulation piece. I think there are a couple of pieces that have come up, and hopefully we'll have a little more time to discuss. I think the resource planning piece, the assets that are in service are supposed to be used and useful and demonstrated by that resource planning. I think that is a bit of a gap in Iowa's system. I think that resource planning is going on. It's supposed to be happening. It is not currently transparent, and there is not, Iowa is an outlier in that we don't have a more formal resource planning process. Most other states, particularly rate regulated states, have integrated resource planning where that is a separate contested case proceeding. That's a gap in Iowa. And another piece that I think is important and probably doesn't get as much attention in Iowa as it should, but Eric touched on the way that rate cases start, and it was all instances where the utility has unrecovered costs and they come in for a rate case. And I think that points to maybe another check that doesn't exist in Iowa. The flip side of that is, if a utility is not coming in for a rate case, there's potentially the fact that the utility could be over earning, and the rates could be too high and customers could be paying too much. But there isn't an equivalent mechanism in Iowa where utilities get called in. The commission could potentially do that, but that is not something that is exercised regularly, and is something that is kind of the flip side of that equation and how rates get set.
And kind of to build on that, one thing to keep in mind is just because a utility isn't coming for a rate increase doesn't mean they don't get a rate increase on an ongoing annual basis. They have over the years built in a lot of automatic adjustments. So those rates are automatically increasing without the Utilities Commission being able to, without having to go through a rate case. I think Mid-American's been out since 2015 or so, yet their rates are about 25% higher in that meantime, right? So that's what Josh is referencing.
So, Olivia, just a couple of things I'd like to add, and particularly around the timing of the rate case or who can initiate a rate case. Josh is correct. It's not just the utility who can do that. There is a mechanism in Iowa that allows the state regulator to initiate a rate case for any reason that they believe it is necessary. One could potentially be over earning, but as Josh is absolutely aware, at least in Mid-American's standpoint, there's a cap on how much that we can earn. We do have something called a revenue sharing mechanism. So once we are at a certain level of earnings, 90% of anything above that goes to our customers. So there is effectively a cap on what Mid-American can earn. And probably one of the reasons why it's not been exercised by the Iowa Utilities Commission, especially in the case of Mid-American. I couldn't speak for any other utility because there is a cap on earnings.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Before we move on to the next question, I just want to open it up. Jeff, is there anything that you would like to add on this topic?
I appreciate the opportunity, Olivia. I think it's helpful to draw the lens back and ask, what this system has provided for Iowa. It is a transparent public participation model, as has been mentioned. And I think it's important for Iowans to know that Mid-Am and Alliant along with the companies who develop wind, solar, and battery storage projects in Iowa, has led to Iowa being one of the leaders in clean energy. And clean energy, wind, solar, battery storage, is some of the cheapest new generation on the grid. So as we think about the transition from fossil fuels to cleaner energy, I think there's good evidence to say that Mid-Am and Alliant both are leading their peers, other utility companies around the country. And we're also known for a state that has better rates than most. And so while the focus might be on an individual bill, and that's important, especially during inflationary times, I think Iowans need to take comfort in the fact that our system, particularly advanced rate making, which allows for clean energy to get onto the grid faster with less red tape, has actually resulted in some of the highest amount of clean energy in the country at very reasonable rates.
Thank you. Just diving into this next question that was partly addressed in some of your responses from the previous question is, how does the Iowa Utilities Commission work with these energy companies to help establish those fair and reasonable rates? How does that happen?
Well, Olivia, we are subject to the regulation of the Iowa Utilities Commission. So as I mentioned in my earlier remarks, the burden of persuading the commission that any change in rates needs to happen, it lies with the energy company. And so we provide that information to them through testimony, through exhibits, through discovery questions. We respond to lots of information requests from them to compile the information that they need to apply the applicable Iowa standards to make the determination of whether those rates need to be changed or not. And that applies both, Bob Rafferty hit on this a bit as well. I don't want to get too technical here, but there are rates, and then there are, as he mentioned, sort of riders that recover certain expenses. And those expenses, I mean, I think the important thing to note about that, we're talking about things like, natural gas to power our natural gas plants. It could also be, costs around transmission related to that. These are just direct expenses that the utility companies incur. There's no markup. There's no profit associated with those riders. Those are, direct pass-throughs for our customers. So that is, I think, one important thing to note around that as well. But we work closely with the Iowa Utilities Commission. They take information from us. They also take information from the intervening parties as well, particularly the Consumer Advocates Office and Josh's group, the Environmental Law and Policy Center. They participate in a lot of cases, as well as Iowa Businesses for Clean Energy, as represented by Mr. Rafferty. But there are a host of other organizations too that represent specific interests, like our large industrial customers. And they review that information, and they provide their own feedback, their own analysis. And then the commission considers all of that to determine whether or not any changes in rates need to be made.
Thank you. Is there anybody else who would like to discuss that?
I think from 30,000 feet, you talk about, even before a rate case, before you go to the judiciary process, you have the public hearings throughout the state, and you talk to your actual customers before this rate goes into effect. And then as we get to the point of the hearing at the IUC, that's where the groups intervene. But there's all kinds of mailings that go out. There's notifications in the paper, and then obviously the public hearings for the customers have a forum to speak about any rate case that might happen.
I think you always have to realize that the Utilities Commission has only so many staff, a few dozen, and so they're always going to be limited in how well they can master a very complicated utility, because they also have a fairly regular turnover on the staff, which is challenging. So in many ways, we have to, as a state, have to trust our utilities to look after our best interests. As Jeff pointed out, Mid-Am and to a lesser, but to somewhat of an okay degree, Alliant has done a terrific job in bringing renewable energy to Iowa. At the same time, we need to realize, hey, wait a minute, let's look how we're incentivizing these for-profit companies, because I think there's value in a for-profit company because it can drive some very positive action. But we have to remember they have a fiduciary responsibility to their stakeholders. And so we want to make sure the incentives that they have are really aligned with producing the most efficient and reliable and clean grid for the future, especially given the fact that, as this whole hour is very much focused on, our grid is changing. So that's something for us to really think about.
Yeah, I wanted to just piggyback on Bob's remark. I mean, one of the challenges, and in any case, the utility is subject to a lot of scrutiny, a lot of data requests. Folks like the group I represent, but also large customers in particular. We're starting to even see some more smaller customer groups. The Office of Consumer Advocate ask a lot of the utilities to open up their books and try and understand everything that is going into those rates. And one of the things that, again, I think we could do to improve the process, improve the transparency, and ultimately improve the outcomes that we experience as a state. And, there are a number of things that have been good about the overall direction that we've gone as a state in terms of adding renewable energy that I think has been cost effective. And the fact that we've been early on that has definitely had advantages. But I think we could improve our process with more transparency on the resource planning side of this question. And if you had actual integrated resource planning where that process was robust and subject to participation by stakeholders, you wouldn't place as much of the burden on the rate case and on the advanced rate making because that work would be done on an ongoing basis in a transparent manner, and there would be questions that get answered in that context. And I think that would be is a really important part of this process, particularly as the electricity system gets more complex going forward.
Building on what Josh just said.
Just two things I'd like to add to that, Olivia. There's just and comments about, I guess, the size of the Iowa Utilities Commission staff. They have increased the size of their staff, and I'll admit, it just feels like if anyone's like me, sometimes there's just not enough hours in the day to get accomplished all the things that you want to get done. But the Iowa Utilities Commission does not operate alone. They do their own analysis. But as we've mentioned multiple times here, there's testimony and exhibits and analysis provided by all of the stakeholders who intervene in those cases as well. And that information, in addition to the own analysis that the commission does, informs their decision. So it's not just as though the commission on its own is just doing all of the analysis. That work is supported by much of the information provided by the Environmental Law and Policy Center, Iowa Business for Clean Energy, our large industrial groups, small and large customers who become involved as well. And the second thing I would add is there's been a lot of discussion around resource planning. Mid-American we've done planning for as long as we've been around. There's been calls to make this a more transparent process. I think there's a lot of transparency provided through the advanced rate making principles process, which is similar to the rate case process we described, very similar in terms of how parties can become involved. But similarly, we have gone through a more transparent process. It seems like that piece of it has not been mentioned yet, but there is a resource evaluation study that's currently ongoing where we are working with our stakeholders and providing them a lot of the information on what we're seeing for load out into the future and what we think a cost-effective portfolio to serve that increased load would look like given various inputs and assumptions around that. Josh's group has certainly been participating in that. They've had the opportunity to provide comments along the way and ask data requests. And once the information is filed with the Iowa Utilities Commission, all parties, not just anyone who's been in the room throughout the resource evaluation process, all parties will have the ability to review that and weigh in on it. And similarly, that type of information would be used as evidence in any future regulatory proceedings, which would also give these interveners an additional opportunity to challenge any assumptions or preferred portfolios that they see in that. So we do think that there is a robust planning process here in Iowa already. And then the last thing I would add around resource planning, and this has been mentioned by Jeff as well, is we've been able to add these, renewable resources. Mid-American has been developing wind for at least 20 years. We have, a lot of wind and a lot of solar, utility scale solar deployed throughout the state. And we've been able to do that and keep our rates low and stable for customers. And I think that is really sort of the proof is in the pudding. When you compare Iowa, the outcomes that Iowa's had to any other state, particularly when it comes to the amount of renewable resources deployed and the impact that has had on rates, I think that's a very positive story to tell for that, and as well as the economic development that it has brought to the state as well. So I just wanted to make sure that was highlighted as a part of this.
And Eric, and I will give credit where credit's due at Mid-American that you guys have competitive rates, and a lot of that has to do with the amount of renewable energy you've invested in. One thing we do need to not miss is that there's many communities throughout Iowa that have residential rates that are 60% higher than Mid-American rates. They have commercial rates that are over 50% higher, and those rates are now going up with a recent increase approved. So those communities in many ways face an existential threat if we continue doing business as usual. They need to make sure those communities can be economically competitive with the neighboring community down the road. Now, there's not easy answers for that, and it's not going to happen overnight, but it's important for us to have a dialogue. Is our system, does it need to be changed because of the evolving grid to make sure those communities can have a bright economic future along with the rest of Iowa? I think that's an important discussion to have.
Thank you. Well, I appreciate the insight from all five of you. This was also something that was touched a bit upon with earlier remarks. But what can consumers do to become more involved in the rate setting process? And what should they do to start educating themselves?
Well, Olivia, I think there are several things that consumers can do to become involved in the process. I think it's important for them to understand who they can turn to in order to resolve issues that they may have with their service or issues that they may have with their rates, and how to participate in the rate case itself. First, I would start with the energy company, your utility company itself. If you have an issue with the quality of your service, if you have an issue with your bill, you don't quite understand something, it's important for you to reach out to your utility as well, just to make sure you can get that information cleared up and get an understanding of what's going on. But sometimes that doesn't necessarily resolve the issue. And if that does not work, you can always turn to the Iowa Utilities Commission. They do have a complaint process where you can both sort of formally or informally resolve disputes that may arise between your utility company and consumers. They're also just a good source of information of what's happening generally in the utility space or the regulated utility space within the state, whether there are any rate cases that are going on. They keep a calendar on their website of all of the hearings and meetings that they have coming up, any notices around rate cases that have been filed, when those customer comment meetings would happen so that you have the ability to speak to, and I think this is really important. There's always a human aspect of this with any rate case that may come about, but consumers have the ability to speak to the Iowa commissioners directly to talk about the impact that may have on the impact that increase may have on them, and also whether or not they think the rate is justified or not. And so I think that those are all very important to keep in mind. But another one that may not get as much attention too is the Iowa Office of Consumer Advocate, which intervenes on behalf of ratepayers in regulatory proceedings in this state. They are also a wealth of information and are plugged, there's a lot of resources and knowledge that they have within that office, but they're also plugged into national groups as well. They keep in touch with other consumer advocates, and they can provide information to them as well to sort of handle any of the issues that you may have. So there are several places that you can turn to become more involved. And if you want to get more educated on it, I think there are several ways. There's always the commission's monthly meetings, which are open to the public, where they approve orders or approve matters before the commission. There's the customer comment meetings. There's the direct line of communication, the number that they can call for the Iowa Utilities Commission. That information, and I think we're required to provide it on our utility bills, but that information is on our bills, but you can certainly find them as well and reach out to them and get answers to the questions that you may have.
Yeah, I might add, there's also the legislature had commissioned the Iowa Utilities Board, now it's Iowa Utilities Commission, to do a study. And that study involved a lot of us stakeholders on this call, as well as others. And that study their recommendations came out last December. And I think it does a nice job highlighting the important steps that could be taken to help modernize our rate regulation. And then the second thing, I would echo what Eric said, the Iowa Consumer Advocate's Office, I would encourage individuals to go there. Again, there's an office, they're the only ones who really represent residential ratepayers and general ratepayers as a whole during these proceedings. And they're challenged. I'll put a plug for them. In the last 20 years, their full-time employee count has been reduced by 50%, despite their responsibilities increasing. So, I think that's something, boy, when you're asking, hey, are we adequately being represented before utility commission proceedings? Because again, the Utilities Commission is supposed to be like a judge. They're not supposed to be really digging in and advocating for one side or the other. But the Consumer Advocate, who has had to take a 50% reduction in resources. So, maybe that's, so there's my little plug for the Consumer Advocate's Office.
I mean, I would add, having this conversation at the rate making level is, I think, really tough for consumers. I think it's abstract, it's technical. I mean, heck, it's hard for me as an intervener engaging in these rate cases. It requires a lot of technical resources, hiring experts, building a record to impact the rate case itself. But the rate case has direct impacts on a lot of different pieces beyond just how much customers are paying that touch customers themselves and where there is customer interest, particularly as we see the grid getting more diverse and interactive. There are energy efficiency programs that matter a lot for customers and that customers can use and their rates set there. There's, we now have smart thermostats and demand response. There are time of use rates that in many cases are optional time of use rates that if customers understand them and can tailor their use, one, they can help the grid, but they can also help lower their bills by using energy at times when the cost of that energy is less, both for them and for the grid itself. There are more opportunities with distributed generation and people having solar on their roofs and and contributing to the grid. And there are definitely issues that impact the rates and impact. We have what we call an inflow-outflow tariff, impact how customers are credited for energy that they send back onto the grid. We are also seeing more customers with electric vehicles, and I think we'll start seeing more more bidirectional chargers and equipment, so that not only do customers charge, but if they're sitting with a battery in their garage, thinking about how that battery can contribute to the grid. All of that is impacted by rate design. It's impacted by these rate cases, and it's really complicated to understand. But maybe the best way to start is on all of those issues that have some direct impact for customers, because we want them to be a part of the future. And actually, the more that they are part of these solutions, whether it be that smart thermostat and energy efficiency or bidirectional charging, those are going to be parts of that clean energy grid of the future and parts of the solution. And we want customers to play that part.
Olivia, to reinforce what Josh was saying, one of the cool things about the modern grid that we're transitioning to is consumers will be empowered to know where their energy is coming from. They'll be empowered to make decisions, sometimes on a daily basis, to, in their own interest, use their energy smarter. Yeah, Mid-Am and Alliant and other energy companies are encouraging that kind of two-way interaction. So the grid won't simply be you getting a bill every month and making sure that your lights turn on. You will be much more involved in being an active participant, which I think is a good thing. So you've heard ways in which you can interact in the public sector, and obviously the utility companies are private companies. But another way that Iowans can empower themselves is to join and support nonprofits. So Clean Grid Alliance is a nonprofit. Josh and Bob and Chaz are nonprofits. And so there's an opportunity there to choose a group that aligns with your interest and be a part of it, which then feeds the information and all the other things that you've heard discussed up to this point. There's newsletters, and the energy world is chock full of what I call alphabet groups. We're one of them, but there are many others. We do newsletters, and we allow our folks that stay in touch with us to gain information, to be active advocates for the grid of the future. So you may have heard of Power Up Iowa, which is in a lot of communities and is helping individual Iowans learn more about a clean grid of the future and how to be a part of that.
That's Jeff just touched on an important point, and it talks about why we need to really have a serious conversation about how we regulate and manage the grid. 100 years ago, when this rate structure and kind of monopoly concept came out of Chicago and spread to, I think, 36 other states operate similar to Iowa, the grid was much simpler. You had a utility that you had a large generating power plant, and the utility owned those. They owned the distribution and transmission that brought energy in one direction to the business and homeowner. The new grid isn't just about the utility owning all the power generation equipment and sending that power one way, just responding to whatever energy needs the business and homeowner has. The grid of the future means individual homeowners are generating power, businesses are generating power. Storage, battery storage is going to be ubiquitous over the next 10 years. And not just that, but the ability to control when you use energy. That becomes very important. Energy use is not even through the day or through the year. In fact, much of the infrastructure that Mid-American and Alliant have to build is to meet about 60 hours to 80 hours of peak demand a year that happens on 6 to 10 really hot days in the summer. That's when our peak time is. So we build enough infrastructure just to make sure we never have brownouts during that period. Well, what if we created more incentives so that we encourage people to use energy during the other non-peak hours when we have plenty of capacity? That would help lower costs. And that becomes particularly important as our grid relies more on what we call intermittent resources, solar and wind. But unfortunately, the incentives for Mid-American is their profit is only based on how many capital assets they own. So, as good natured and as they want to do a good job, the fact is they have a fiduciary responsibility to their stakeholders to try to control have as much capital investment as possible. But that's not the future grid. They need to earn their highest profits when they're making the grid most efficient and being a really good operator of all the assets that are out there. They shouldn't have a financial disincentive to encourage customers to move power to a non-peak time as they do now. We need to find ways to eliminate those disincentives that encourage an inefficient grid, so that the utilities' interests are once again aligned with ratepayers, because no amount of staff at the Utilities Commission is ever going to be able to manage the utilities. They have to manage themselves. So let's make sure the incentives are right so they manage in the most beneficial way for ratepayers.
So, Bob, I've heard you say this a couple of times, and I just want to be clear. Yeah, Mid-American does have stakeholders, and there is some fiduciary responsibilities associated with that. But at the same time, we actually, more than a fiduciary, actually have a statutory, a legal obligation to our customers. And we work every day to make sure that that is fulfilled. And it's true not only of Mid-American, but of any rate-regulated utility in the state of Iowa. And I agree with you. The grid is changing. You and Josh have mentioned this a few times, that it is. There are new technologies. There's change in demand. I mean, you sort of mentioned these few hot hours across the summertime. That's actually changing. There are a lot of winter peaking utilities now, and particularly when you talk about electrification and these cold snaps that may happen. It's not just a hot day in July where you could reach your demand. It could be, the middle of December as well. And so we do have to prepare for that, in part because we have that statutory requirement to provide reliable service and safe service at just and reasonable rates, as you're aware. So yeah, we do work a lot on that. And I think there are a lot of opportunities through the Resource Evaluation Study to work with your group, to work with the Environmental Law and Policy Center, to really figure out what are the best resources, what sort of technologies we should be using in order to serve that demand.
Thank you all for the insight on that. Just to roll into another question, because looking at the clock, we have about 13 minutes left. We have one question from an audience member. Their question reads, there is a concept called industry captured regulation. Please discuss whether we have this in Iowa or not.
Industry captured regulation, to me, that I've heard it described as regulatory capture. If we're talking about the same issue, which is you may have regulators who may move off of being from the regulatory body, moving directly to working for an entity that they regulated. To my knowledge, that is not an issue in Iowa. We have had commissioners roll off of our Iowa Utilities Commission. I've only been in Iowa 6 years, so I couldn't, say it has never happened before. But to my knowledge, since I've been here, there's been one who has rolled off, who did go to work for a utility, but it was an out-of-state utility. He works in Colorado for a particular utility, and they do have a very, very small service territory here, just a few thousand customers. But outside of that, when commissioners have left, they've either retired or they've gone back to their previous jobs. We did have a former commissioner who used to work for Mid-American Energy Company, but he did not come directly from the regulatory body to the entity. He had a couple of jobs in between and had been off of the commission for several years before he came. So I don't see it as a particular issue here in Iowa, but I certainly would welcome input from others.
Are there any other thoughts? Oh, Josh, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I will say, I guess I'm not quite as rosy on that as Eric might be. I mean, I do think that there are some issues, and it's not just commissioners themselves, but it's commission staff. I mean, I think there is a fair amount of turnover and a number of folks who've worked for the commission at one point or another who, if you look today, are now working at the utilities. I think that's a challenge in an industry like this. That's a small number of people who have expertise. And so the industry, it's natural in part for the industry to look there. But I also think part of this question is also on, I think, a little bit on the resource discrepancy as well. And the way that policy gets made, the way that if you look at how folks engage, yes, groups like mine can weigh in front of the board or in front of the commission and provide expert testimony. But the resources that we have and our ability to engage is a small fraction of what the utility can do. The same thing if you look at the statutory framework that Eric has referenced several times. That statutory framework has changed over time. I mean, one of the things and sometimes it's a challenge for us to even get the regulators to implement what we think the statutory framework says. And I'll give a really good example of this whole process where we took a case, a utility commission case, to the state Supreme Court. And the state Supreme Court agreed with our interpretation of the law. The same day that the state Supreme Court order came down, there was a bill that the governor was ready to sign that same day, changing that law. And that shows, that shows the power of the industry to engage in all aspects of the regulatory process. And when you're talking about monopoly utilities and the rate regulation process being sort of that check, I think it's disturbing that the folks who are monopoly utilities have that much power in this process and sway in this process. So I think there is concern in Iowa.
I'll give you maybe one more example of that. I mentioned this study that the legislature had requested back in 23. So all of the second half of last year, it was a wide stakeholder involvement, a very good process. They brought in some outside, the Utilities Commission brought in outside experts to facilitate and prepare the report. They had several recommendations. In fact, one of them was to either reform or eliminate advanced rate making. And the legislature not only did not reform advanced rate making, but they expanded it. And I think there's an example that the playing field is not level in regards to the political environment on this. I think the utilities very much have the resources to have the edge. And that's, there's no formal organization out there that represents residential ratepayers, for example.
Let me be, I just want to make sure I heard that correctly, Bob. If what I heard you say was that advanced rate making principles has been expanded since the rate making study was completed.
I believe the legislation passed last year included more, expanded the definition of what qualifies for advanced rate making, did it not?
There was, and let's be clear about that. I think you're referencing the change to the definition of alternate energy production facilities. That
Correct.
did not come from any energy company. That legislation was sponsored and put forward by the Iowa Utilities Commission. So that did not come from
Eric, that only passed
me.
because the utilities wanted that passed.
We had nothing to do with how that was changed. So if there's an issue with that, I mean, that would be a discussion for folks at the Iowa Utilities Commission. But let me be clear about the question that we were asked.
That's just not correct.
Was about regulatory capture, which generally revolves around individuals who have the ability to vote and make decisions on the utilities joining a utility. Whether or not an entity has political power may not be directly connected to that. And just so we're clear, we do work at our Iowa Utilities Commission. We advocate there. We also advocate at the Iowa General Assembly, but we also see many other interveners up there as well. The tech customers, the Iowa Environmental Council as well. They have lobbyists. They are taking meetings with legislators as well, and they are doing the same actions that any rate regulated utility may be doing.
Well, I mean, Eric, let me ask, I mean, since you're being candid, I mean, do you weigh in on who the regulators should be?
I have not weighed in on who any regulator should be. We do not weigh in on who the regulators should be. That is a decision for the governor. The governor appoints a regulator, and then the regulators are confirmed by the Senate.
And in my 5 years, we've never weighed in. I've been here 5 years, so not in the governor's office or anything. So,
Olivia, if I may, I think this is important to point out that the Iowa Utility Commissioners are Iowans. They have served their communities in other ways before they've come to the commission. They are seen as leaders. It's been mentioned in this conversation that you want people who are knowledgeable in energy to be able to serve on those commissions. So it's very likely they've had some experience in some way. And I think it is important that if people don't believe that that is working, they have an opportunity to talk to their legislators. I'm a former legislator. I have voted for people to serve on boards and commissions. I've also been on that side of the table when I was appointed to be a DOT commissioner in Iowa. And so if you want to improve the system, I think it's best to focus on the changes that you want and less about the personalities. These are Iowans who are serving in that capacity, and I think it's important to keep that in mind.
Thank you for that.
It's a difficult job too. I would just like to add, it's a difficult job. You are weighing the interests of so many different parties and weighing in on something that has a very direct impact on household budgets. And everyone's not always going to be happy. So there will always be a lot of conspiracies around what is happening and what's not happening, depending on whether you were successful on one particular issue or not. But let me just be 100% clear. No one is 100% successful with the Iowa Utilities Commission. Yeah. It is independent, and it does have a mind of its own.
And I should acknowledge I've got several of the former commissioners as board members of mine. So obviously they appoint some pretty good people.
Right. And I think it's important. It's important to point out that the commission itself did have ideas that they wanted the legislature to act on, including some that have been discussed here, and were supportive of it. And so, and they weren't adopted in whole. So I think, the idea that they get everything they want is not factually correct, which is why I think we should focus on improvements that we want to make and use the process to try to get those changes and recognize these are Iowans who've elected to serve and honor that sacrifice that they're making.
Well, thank you all so much for your insight and for being here today. We are just at about time, so we're going to wrap it up now. But thank you, Bob, Eric, Chaz, Jeff, and Josh for your time. And thank you to the attendees for attending this session today, and hope that you have a more of an understanding about how these utility costs work after attending this session today. So thank you all and have a good rest of your afternoon.
Thank you.